The Roman Empire considered for centuries that Britain was only a myth, a distant land lost in the ocean. Everything changed in the year 55 BC when Julius Caesar set sail for its shores in search of glory. Although his invasion ended in defeat, almost a century later, Emperor Claudius managed to conquer the island, found Londinium, and extend Rome's power to the north. The Romans built roads, walls, and temples, leaving a mark that endured even after their retreat, when the empire began to crumble. After the fall of the Roman Empire, the island was invaded by the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, who formed the first English kingdoms and gave rise to a new culture. Later came the Vikings, who plundered and dominated much of the territory until the Normans under William the Conqueror unified England in 166. In the Middle Ages, England was the scene of decisive wars and legendary figures. Kings such as Richard the Lionheart fought in the Crusades, carrying the name of their kingdom beyond the continent. Henry V achieved an unexpected victory at Agincourt, where an English army defeated vastly superior French forces. Meanwhile, legends such as Robin Hood, the archer who stole from the rich to help the poor, emerged among the people. Castles, kingdoms, and battlefields marked an era where courage, faith, and ambition defined England's destiny and forged its identity as one of Europe's most feared and admired powers. The origins of Britain: Celts, Druids, and ancient tribes. Long before the name England existed, the island of Britain was a territory covered in dense forests, mist-shrouded hills, and vast rivers that served as sacred routes. There lived tribes that did not leave marble cities or stone empires, but circles of monoliths aligned with the stars, burial mounds, and mysterious rites performed under the open sky. These people Greco-Roman historians would call Britons, but they recognized themselves as clans, united by blood, earth, and the invisible gods that dwelt in the trees and waters. Their languages belonged to the Celtic trunk. Their memory was oral, and their symbols deeply spiritual. The island had been populated since the Paleolithic, but it was in the Iron Age, around the 8th century BC, when the Celtic tribes began to settle definitively. They came from the European continent, probably from the regions that today correspond to France and Germany, gradually moving westwards, driven by other migratory waves. They did not enter as a single people, but as multiple tribes, among them the Iceni, Trinovantes, Brigantes, and Catuvellaunos. Each occupied a territory bounded by rivers or hills, ruled by warrior chieftains whose authority depended on both lineage and their ability to protect their people. Unlike the Mediterranean civilizations, the Celts did not build large cities. Their settlements were called oppida and were fortresses on the hills surrounded by wooden palisades or earthen walls. They not only sheltered the population during conflicts, but also functioned as centers of trade and ritual. Wealth was measured in livestock, finely decorated weapons, or gold and enamel jewelry. Their society was divided into three orders: the warriors, in charge of defending the territory; the druids, possessors of religious and legal knowledge; and the common people, dedicated to agriculture, metallurgy, and commerce. This division was not only functional but sacred, since each group represented an aspect of the order of the world. The Celtic religion developed outside of permanent temples. Their sacred places were forest clearings, lakes, and rivers, where offerings of weapons, jewelry, and sometimes human sacrifices were made. The main god was Lugh, lord of light and craftsmanship, although other gods such as Cernunnos, the god of deer, and Taranis, the god of thunder, occupied a central place in their mythologies. There was no single doctrine, but a common pantheon adapted to each tribe. The Druids acted as priests, judges, and guardians of the collective memory. They did not write down their knowledge. They transmitted it orally, memorizing laws, genealogies, and myths during years of training in remote forests. Women had an important role in Celtic society. They could inherit lands, lead tribes, and even command armies, as Queen Boudica would later demonstrate. Marriage alliances between tribes were essential to peace, although war was a constant. Disputes over grazing territories or trade routes led to swift skirmishes, in which Celtic warriors would throw themselves into battle in war chariots, shouting furiously as they waved their long swords and falcatas. The Celtic peoples did not live in isolation. They maintained contact with the Phoenician and Greek merchants who came to their shores attracted by Cornish tin, an essential metal for the manufacture of bronze. Over time, objects from the Mediterranean began to penetrate: wine amphorae, fine ceramics, and minted coins. These contacts introduced new ideas and knowledge of a world beyond the sea, but they also caught the attention of an emerging power, Rome. The island that the inhabitants themselves called Britannia was first mentioned by Greek navigators in the 4th century BC, as a distant place covered in mist, inhabited by fierce tribes and marked by the magic of the Druids. However, for the Romans, Britain represented both a mystery and an opportunity. Julius Caesar was the first to dare to cross the English Channel to explore the island. In the year 55 BC, in 400 BC, he led a reconnaissance expedition, encountering fierce resistance from the Britons. Although he did not achieve a permanent conquest, he returned the following year with more legions and obtained the symbolic submission of some tribal chiefs. Their interest was not to occupy it, but to demonstrate the reach of Rome and to warn the tribes of Gaul that no refuge was safe. After Caesar's departure, Britain continued to be divided among numerous tribal kingdoms. Some began to adopt Roman elements, establishing trade alliances with the continent. Others joined together in defensive confederations, fearing a future invasion. The Druids, who maintained great spiritual and political influence, became defenders of British identity in the face of increasing Romanization. In their forest shrines on Mona Island, present-day Anglesey, they preserved ceremonies and prophecies that spoke of an inevitable struggle between the Free Peoples and the Southern Empire. Meanwhile, the Celtic social structure evolved. Kings began to issue gold coins with their own symbols, indicating a complex and hierarchical economy. Some tribes built monumental fortifications such as Maiden Castle or Danebury, preparing for a full-scale war. On a spiritual level, Druid prophecies gained importance, heralding the arrival of a foreign power that would forever change the destiny of the island. The sacred landscape of Britain was already marked by thousand-year-old monuments. Stonehenge, although erected thousands of years before the arrival of the Celts, was still a center of ritual power. The Druids considered it a bridge between the world of the living and that of the gods, aligned with the solstices and the paths of the sun. Other sites, such as Avebury and Silbury Hill, demonstrated the spiritual depth of the land, where every stone and mound had a ceremonial purpose. By the 1st century AD, Britain was a patchwork of warrior tribes, ancient religions, and prophecies. Each clan defended its territory with pride, but all shared the certainty that the world was changing. Beyond the canal, the Roman Empire was reaching its apogee, expanding like a relentless storm. The ancestral gods watched in silence as the eagles of the empire was preparing to cross the sea again, heralding the end of an ancient era and the beginning of a new history for the island of Britain. The Roman conquest of Britain. When Emperor Claudius ascended the throne of Rome in 41 AD. In the 1st century BC, the empire was going through a transitional stage. The veteran generals doubted their strength. The Senate saw him as a ruler imposed by the Praetorian Guard rather than by the will of the people. To consolidate his authority, Claudius needed a conquest that would evoke the greatness of Julius Caesar and place his name alongside that of the great emperors. Britain, that fog-shrouded island in the north of the known world, offered the perfect opportunity. The Romans had already tried to penetrate their territory decades before. Julius Caesar crossed the English Channel in 55 BC with an expeditionary force, defeating some coastal tribes but retreating without annexing the island. His second attempt in 54 BC, he was more successful, getting some British kings to offer tribute to Rome. However, the legions did not remain. Britain continued as an alien world on the fringes of the Roman order, a kingdom of druids, warrior tribes, and kings who changed allegiances as they saw fit. Around the year 43 AD, the circumstances were different. Rome controlled all of Gaul and contacts with Britain had grown. Some tribal kings traded with the empire, importing wine, pottery, and Roman coins. Others, on the other hand, were afraid of the growing foreign influence. The trigger for the invasion was an internal crisis. Verica, king of the Atrebates and an ally of Rome, was deposed by the tribe of the Catuvellonians. He fled to the mainland and asked Emperor Claudius for help. This request offered the perfect pretext for a large-scale conquest. In the spring of 43 AD in 400 BC, an army of 4 legions, supported by auxiliary units and cavalry, embarked in the port of Boulogne-sur-Mer. An estimated 40,000 men crossed the Channel, one of the largest military operations of the time. The initial command was held by Aulus Plautius, an experienced commander. The legions landed on the southeastern coast of Britain, probably at Richborough or Chichester, facing a coalition of tribes led by Caratacus and Togodumnus, princes of the Catuvelaons, determined to prevent the Roman advance. The British tribes fought bravely and chaotically. They threw themselves en masse against the Roman ranks, trusting in their ferocity. But the legions responded with iron discipline, advancing in close formation, protected by rectangular shields and throwing their pilum before drawing their short gladius swords. The first battles culminated in defeats for the British, who retreated inland. Rome secured each position by building temporary forts and logistical roads linking the coast to the interior, introducing imperial order at every step. Carataco, a resistant leader, continued to oppose it with guerrilla tactics. His brother Togodumno was killed in combat, but he managed to unify various tribes against the invaders. Aulus Plautius consolidated the advance to the River Thames. It was then that Emperor Claudius, desirous of glory, decided to personally join the campaign for the final blow. He crossed Gaul, crossed the Channel, and arrived in Britain accompanied by war elephants, a symbol of imperial power. The coordinated attack on Camulodunum, the capital of the enemy kingdom, was decisive. The British defences did not resist the thrust of the legions or the terror caused by the war animals unknown to Celtic warriors. Camulodunum fell, and Claudius accepted the formal surrender of several British kings. In that city, the first permanent Roman colony was established, Colonia Claudia Victricensis. This act symbolically sealed the conquest. Britain was incorporated into the empire as a province. With the subjugation of the southeast assured, the works that would transform the landscape began. Straight roads were built connecting the main centres of Roman power. From Camulodunum to Londinium, a new city founded on the banks of the Thames. From Londinium to Verulamium, another sprawling colony. The Roman roads, paved with stone and gravel, allowed the rapid movement of troops and the transport of goods. Permanent fortresses were built, such as Isca and Eboracum, modern York, which would later become regional capitals. However, the resistance was not over. Caratacus continued to fight from the mountains of Wales, creating a confederation of hostile tribes. For years he led ambushes against the Romans, attacking isolated garrisons. In the year 51 AD, he was finally captured after being betrayed by Queen Cartimandua of the Brigands. Sent to Rome, he was presented to the Senate. Far from begging for his life, he gave a speech that so impressed the emperor that Claudius forgave him and allowed him to live in the imperial capital as a symbol of Roman clemency. With tribal resistance weakened, the Romans advanced north and west. However, absolute dominance of the island could not be achieved immediately. The Druids, guardians of the spiritual fervor and collective memory of the Britons, became the main target of the empire. From their sacred center on the island of Mona, they led rites calling for resistance against foreign rule. Around the year 60 AD, in 400 BC, the governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus led an expedition to destroy them. The troops crossed the strait and attacked the shrines. The Druids were massacred, sacred groves cut down, and tribal symbols burned in an attempt to remove the spiritual basis of the rebellion. As Rome consolidated its control in the north, a new enemy emerged in the south. In the same year, 60 AD, in 400 BC, Queen Boudica of the Iceni led a mass rebellion. Her husband, an ally of Rome, had died, leaving his kingdom supposedly under imperial protection, but the Romans confiscated his lands and humiliated his husband, family. Boudica's anger unleashed unprecedented fury. His warriors razed Camulodunum, burned Londinium and Verulamium, slaughtering its Roman and Romanized British inhabitants. The rebellion was eventually harshly put down, leaving tens of thousands dead and securing Roman rule over the region. Despite this resistance, the Roman conquest irreversibly transformed Britain. A monetary economy was introduced, aqueducts, temples, and forums were built, and Latin was imposed as the language of administration. For many Britons, being part of the empire meant access to markets, military protection, and a new imperial identity. For others, it was the beginning of the end of their ancestral world, of the gods of the forests and the songs of the Druids. On the remains of the ancient clans, Rome built a new Britain, crossed by stone roads and governed by the law of the imperial eagle. The collapse of Roman rule and the Saxon invasion. For more than 3 centuries, Britain had been a province of the Roman Empire, administered by governors, protected by legions, and connected to the Mediterranean world by trade routes. Its cities became rich, its elites adopted Latin and Roman architecture, and Christianity began to spread among the population. But at the beginning of the 4th century AD, the balance was broken. What had been a firm border of the empire became a vulnerable territory, isolated and threatened on all sides. Rome no longer had the strength to defend its boundaries. The crisis was deep and the imperial order was beginning to dissolve. In 367 AD, Britain was hit by a series of attacks known as the Great Conspiracy. Picts to the north, Scots from Ireland, and Saxons from the North Sea launched coordinated raids, plundering villas, destroying fortifications, and capturing prisoners. The Roman defences collapsed. The walls of Hadrian's Wall were breached. The cities, accustomed to the protection of the legions, found themselves defenceless. Rome sent reinforcements, but they were increasingly scarce. The priorities of the empire had shifted to other, more strategic regions of the continent. The 4th century was a succession of crises. The legions of Britain revolted on several occasions, proclaiming local emperors who marched to the continent to try to seize power in Rome. Every time an army left the island to engage in civil wars, it left behind a weaker territory. Taxes were rising while trade was declining. Cities began to be walled not against foreign armies, but against bands of local raiders and neighboring tribes. The empire was no longer a shield, but a memory. Around 410 AD, the situation came to a head. Rome was threatened by Alaric's Visigoths. Emperor Honorius, unable to send help, responded to a desperate plea from the British authorities by ordering them to fend for themselves. That letter marked the end of Roman rule on the island. The legions were permanently withdrawn. The imperial officers left their posts. Britain, a proud province of the empire, was left alone in the face of chaos. Without Roman rule, the system quickly collapsed. The aristocratic villas were abandoned or fortified. The roads deteriorated. Latin began to lose ground to local languages. Christianity survived in small, isolated communities, but Roman temples fell into ruin. The ancient tribes reappeared, now as small, independent kingdoms fighting each other for control of territory. The Romano-British elites tried to maintain order, but they lacked a centralized army. Agriculture was reduced to a subsistence economy. The rural population began to rebuild tribal structures, seeking protection from warrior leaders. As Britain plunged into instability, new threats emerged from the sea. Germanic peoples from the coasts of what is now Denmark and northern Germany, known as Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, began arriving first as raiders, attacking coastal villages and quickly retreating. But the defences were weak, and soon their raids turned into invasions. The Britons, unable to stop them, resorted to a desperate strategy: hire Saxon mercenaries to protect the territory in exchange for land. This initial agreement, mentioned by sources such as Gildas, marked the beginning of an irreversible change on the island. The Saxon chieftains arrived not as temporary soldiers, but as colonizers. They first settled in the southeast, building fortified settlements. Over time, they demanded more land. Their populations increased due to continuous migration from the continent. The Germanic tribes did not recognize the authority of the British kings. When they felt strong enough, they rebelled against their former employers. According to later chronicles, around 450 AD, in 400 BC, the Saxon leaders Hengist and Horsa defeated the Britons in a decisive battle, opening the door to widespread invasion. The British chronicles speak of massive destruction. Villages were burned, the native population massacred or enslaved. Some Britons fled westwards, taking refuge in Wales and Cornwall. Others crossed the Channel to Armorica, where they founded the Kingdom of Brittany. The ancient Roman cities were abandoned or fell under Saxon rule, transforming into new centers of Germanic power. Roman culture almost completely disappeared. Latin was replaced by the Germanic languages, giving rise to Old English. The Saxon conquest was not a single attack, but a series of migratory waves. The Angles occupied the centre and north of the island, founding the kingdoms of Northumbria, Stanglia, and Mercia. The Saxons settled in the south, giving rise to the kingdoms of Sussex, Wessex, and Essex. The Jutes founded the Kingdom of Kent. Each of these Germanic kingdoms acted independently, competing each other for control of the territory. However, they shared the same culture: warlike, pagan, and profoundly different from the Roman-British tradition. Religious structures also changed. The Druids had disappeared under Roman rule, and Christianity was relegated to small monastic enclaves. The Germans brought with them their own deities, Woden, Thunor, and Tiw, who would later name the days of the week in English. Their rituals were performed in forests and mounds with no permanent temples. Society was organized around loyalty to the warlord and blood ties. The law was oral, based on revenge and compensation through Wehrgeld, the price of blood. By the middle of the 6th century, Britain was no longer Roman. The island had been completely transformed. The Old Britons were reduced to minorities on the margins of the island, while new Germanic kingdoms dominated the center and south. The Roman order had collapsed not only politically, but culturally. In its place arose a new world, forged by the iron of Saxon warriors, fueled by constant migration, and marked by the strife between rival tribes that would shape England's future. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and the formation of England. With the definitive collapse of Roman power and the advance of the Germanic peoples, Britain ceased to be an imperial province to become a political archipelago of emerging kingdoms. These new domains did not arise from a unified conquest, but from the gradual establishment of Anglo, Saxon, and Jute clans, which occupied territories, erected centers of power, and began to fight each other for control of the island. This era, known as the Heptarchy, was marked by the existence of 7 major kingdoms that dominated English politics between the 6th and 9th centuries: Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex, and Wessex. Each kingdom had its own identity, rulers, and social structures, but they shared common traits derived from Germanic culture. The king's power did not come from an institutionalized divine right, as would later occur, but from the ability to command in battle, protect his people, and distribute rewards to his warriors. The king was followed by a military retinue called a comitatus, composed of sworn nobles who received land in exchange for loyalty. Anglo-Saxon society was organized into agricultural villages where wealth was measured in cattle and arable land. The law was transmitted orally and justice was applied in local assemblies known as moots. The oldest kingdom in the Heptarchy was Kent, founded by the Jutes under the legendary King Hengist. Located to the southeast, he was the first to establish diplomatic and marriage contacts with the Franks of the continent. Their king, Ethelbert of Kent, married a Christian Frankish princess, which would pave the way for the arrival of the mission of St. Augustine of Canterbury. East Anglia, ruled by East Angles, controlled the North Sea trade routes, and it became an important cultural centre. Essex, Sussex, and Wessex were founded by different branches of the Saxons, each gradually expanding from small colonies into wider territories. In the north, the Anglo-Kingdom of Northumbria emerged from the union of 2 previous entities, Bernicia and Deira. Its strategic position allowed it to dominate a large part of the island during the 7th century. Kings such as Edwin and Oswald became legendary figures, combining war with conversion to Christianity and the founding of monasteries. For a time, Northumbria even controlled territories beyond Hadrian's Wall, exerting influence over the British and Pictish peoples. However, the kingdom that would achieve the greatest political power in the central period of the Heptarchy was Mercia. Located in the heart of the island, it controlled the land routes and river valleys of central England. Its most famous king, Offa, ruled from 757 to 796 and managed to subdue other kingdoms until he became the main lord of the island. Offa had a colossal fortification known as Offa's Wall built, a long earthen defence that separated Mercia from Welsh territories. Under his reign, Mercia established diplomatic relations with Charlemagne's Carolingian Empire, minted standardized coins, and established unprecedented political dominance. Wessex in the southwest had a more gradual development. At first, it was one of the minor kingdoms, constantly threatened by its neighbours, but its dynastic structure allowed it to maintain political continuity. In the middle of the 8th century, under King Ine, Wessex promulgated a written legal code, one of the first in the Old English language. This codification of law set a precedent for internal organisation and consolidated royal authority over local nobles. The relations between the kingdoms of the Heptarchy were complex. None of them maintained a permanent dominance. The balance of power was constantly oscillating. In the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, the term Bretwalda is mentioned, used to designate the king who, at a given time, exercised primacy over the others. It was a de facto supremacy, based on military power. Kings such as Earl of Sussex, Edwin of Northumbria, Oswald of Northumbria, and Offa of Mercia were recognized as Bretwaldas at different times, but his authority depended on his ability to maintain the loyalty of other lesser kings through alliances, marriages, or conquests. Anglo-Saxon society also began to define itself culturally during this period. The Old English language began to form from the Germanic dialects. Court poets recited long epic poems, such as Beowulf, which chronicled the exploits of legendary heroes. The metallurgical arts reached a high level, as evidenced by the Sutton Hoo hoard, an Anglo-Saxon royal tomb where a ceremonial helmet, ornate weapons, and gold objects were found, revealing the wealth and sophistication of these courts. Roman influences persisted in a residual way. Some Roman villas were repurposed as fortresses. Imperial roads still marked strategic routes. But the Roman administration had disappeared. Each Anglo-Saxon kingdom had its own laws, armies, and religious customs. Christianity was beginning to spread again, especially from Kent and Northumbria, but there was no religious unity. In many villages, the cult of Woden and Thunor was still predominant. The formation of England was not a sudden process, but a long competition between these kingdoms. Each sought hegemony, but none maintained it permanently during the Heptarchy. Mercia was dominant for much of the 8th century. Northumbria had been so in the 7th, and Wessex would begin to ascend in the 9th century. The geopolitics of the island were dynamic, marked by constant wars, broken alliances, and the emergence of charismatic leaders who could change the destiny of an entire region with a single campaign. The arrival of Christianity and the conversion of kings. When the Romans left Britain, they left behind an expanding faith, Christianity. Although the ecclesiastical structure collapsed under imperial power, small communities of believers survived in the western and northern parts of the island. There, far from the pagan Germanic kingdoms, a particular form of Christianity flourished, deeply influenced by the monastic spirituality of Ireland. Meanwhile, to the east and south, where the Angles and Saxons predominated, the worship of the old gods persisted. The clash between the two religious traditions would determine the course of the future England. Celtic Christianity, with roots in Irish monasteries founded by figures such as St. Patrick and St. Columba, expanded into northern Britain during the 6th century. In places like Iona and Lindisfarne arose monastic centres dedicated to penance, prayer, and the preservation of ancient texts. Irish monks practiced rigorous asceticism, combining elements of pre-Christian Celtic spirituality with Christian doctrine. They were not under the direct authority of Rome, but followed their own liturgical traditions and systems of calculating the date of Easter. For many Britons and Picts, this Christianity represented a spiritual continuity with their ancestral past, a bridge between the pagan world and the new faith. Meanwhile, on the mainland, the Church of Rome sought to regain influence in the Lost Islands. Pope Gregory the Great, concerned about the spread of paganism among the Anglo-Saxons, decided to send an evangelizing mission led by the monk Augustine. In 597 AD, Augustine landed in Kent, backed by King Ethelbert, who had married the Frankish princess Bertha, a devout Christian. Ethelbert ruled one of the most powerful kingdoms in the south, and his conversion would have far-reaching consequences. Augustine was received in Canterbury, where he began his missionary work. The king, although initially reluctant to abandon the ancestral gods, understood the political power of Christianity as a link with the continent. The Christian faith promised not only spiritual salvation, but also access to diplomatic alliances with the Christians, Frankish kingdoms, and the favour of Rome. Ethelbert of Kent was baptized, and with him a large part of his court. Canterbury became the first Roman ecclesiastical centre on the island. From there, Augustine founded churches, established dioceses, and sent missionaries to other kingdoms. However, Christianity did not spread evenly. In Northumbria, the influence first came from the Celtic monks of Iona. King Oswald, exiled in Ireland during his youth, returned to his kingdom with the Irish faith and founded the monastery of Lindisfarne, which became the spiritual focus of the north. The Celtic monks preached a faith of personal sacrifice, isolated from political power, based on pilgrimage and contemplation. In contrast, Roman missionaries promoted a centralized hierarchical structure closely linked to royal authority. These differences generated growing tensions. Celtic Christians used a different method to tonsure the hair of monks and celebrated Easter on different dates than those established by Rome. Behind these apparent formalities lay a struggle for authority. Should the English Church submit to the Pope of Rome or maintain its independence in accordance with the Irish tradition? The kings understood that Christianity was more than a religion. It was an instrument to consolidate internal power and obtain external legitimacy. The Northumbria court became the scene of this dispute. King Oswiu, heir to the Celtic faith, faced pressure from his wife, who was an adept of the Roman rite. The confrontation culminated in the Synod of Whitby in 664. There, bishops and abbots of both traditions presented their arguments. The Roman side insisted on the authority of St. Peter, custodian of the keys to heaven, while the Celts defended the antiquity of their rites. Finally, King Oswiu decided in favor of Rome, declaring that he did not wish to oppose the guardian of the gates of heaven. That decision marked the triumph of Roman Christianity in England and the subordination of the Church to the papacy. From then on, the conversion of kings accelerated. In Wessex, King Cynegils was baptized with Oswald of Northumbria as godfather, creating an alliance between the two kingdoms. In Mercia, the powerful King Peada adopted Christianity as a condition for marrying a Northumbrian princess. Faith became diplomatic currency. Upon conversion, kings legitimized their power as God's representatives on earth, and they received support from monks and bishops who acted as scribes, counselors, and ambassadors. Monasteries multiplied throughout the island. They were not only religious centers, but also centers of learning, agriculture, and artistic production. In places like Jarrow and Wearmouth, manuscripts were copied, preserving Latin works and creating their own chronicles. From these monasteries emerged the figure of Bede the Venerable, a monk and historian who wrote the Ecclesiastical History of the English People, a work that not only narrated the conversion of the kingdoms, but also consolidated the idea of a unified identity under Christianity. The process of conversion did not imply the immediate disappearance of the old beliefs. Many practices were assimilated into the Christian calendar. Sacred places were transformed into churches. Agricultural festivities were reinterpreted as religious celebrations. The Christianization of the Anglo-Saxons was both a spiritual change and a strategy of power. Kings began to rule not only by force but by divine mandate, and the monasteries, by registering genealogies and legitimizing lineages, became custodians of national memory. Christianity not only spiritually unified the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, but reconnected them with Europe. The island was leaving behind the isolation of the post-Roman era and re-entering the sphere of Western Christianity. But while the kingdoms celebrated their new faith, ships with carved prows approached from the northern seas. The pagans had not disappeared. They were about to arrive, and with them would begin the darkest and most decisive period in English history. Alfred the Great, the king who saved England. By the end of the 9th century, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms faced the greatest threat of their existence. From the shores of the Baltic and the fjords of Norway, the Vikings had left behind sporadic raids to undertake permanent conquests. They arrived in large armies known as the Great Pagan Army, accompanied by women, artisans, and cattle, with the clear intention of settling in the most fertile lands of Britain. Within decades, the kingdoms of Northumbria and East Anglia fell under Danish rule. Mercia was dismembered. There was only one free kingdom left, Wessex. Its sovereignty rested with a young king, Alfred. Alfred assumed the throne in 871 in a context of continuous defeat. The Danish forces commanded by Guthrum were not just plundering warriors, but experienced conquerors who founded settlements and claimed tribute. The coast was in enemy hands. The cities had been besieged and abandoned. It seemed inevitable that Wessex would follow the fate of the rest of the island. However, Alfredo understood that victory did not depend only on military courage, but on a profound strategic and political transformation. Alfredo's first decision was to reorganize the defensive system. He abandoned the traditional model of temporarily called armies, which responded to the king's call for a short period, and instituted permanent military service. He divided the army in two so that one part would always remain active while the other returned to their lands. With this, he guaranteed a constant force available to face unexpected attacks. At the same time, he began the construction of a network of burhs, fortresses of earth and wood strategically located along rivers and roads. These burhs served not only as shelters, but also as administrative centers from which defense was coordinated and territorial control was assured. Alfred's second crucial reform was the creation of a naval fleet. He understood that the Vikings dominated the seas and that to defeat them it was necessary to face them in that terrain. He had longer and taller ships built than the Scandinavian drakkars, designed to sail both on rivers and in the open sea. Alfred's fleet patrolled the coasts, intercepting enemy vessels before they landed. This naval force marked the birth of the English navy, which centuries later would become the heart of the kingdom's power. In the year 878, Alfred faced the decisive moment of his reign. Guthrum launched a surprise attack over the winter, seeking to destroy Wessex before he could rally his troops. Alfred responded quickly, summoning his warriors by smoke signals and messengers. The final battle took place near Edington. The sources describe how the Anglo-Saxon troops advanced in close formation, interlocking shields, resisting the Viking thrust. At the end of the fighting, the Danes were defeated. Guthrum surrendered and, as part of the peace agreement, accepted Christian baptism, adopting the name Athelstan. A treaty was established dividing the island. The south and west would remain under Wessex rule, while the east and north would be controlled by the Danes under what would become known as the Danelaw. Far from considering this truce as an end, Alfred interpreted it as an opportunity to reorganize the kingdom. He initiated a legal reform, compiling old laws and adapting them to the new times. It integrated elements of Roman law, Germanic customs, and Christian principles. Their goal was to create a uniform system that would consolidate the king's authority over nobles and peasants. He strengthened education, founding schools to train the sons of the nobility and promoting the translation of Latin texts into Old English. He himself participated in this work, translating works such as Bede's Ecclesiastical History. For Alfred, the strength of the kingdom depended not only on weapons but also on knowledge. On a religious level, Alfredo used the church as a tool of national unification. He promoted the founding of monasteries and encouraged bishops to establish ecclesiastical schools and courts. Christianity became a symbol of cultural resistance to Viking paganism. Guthrum's conversion was not only a spiritual act but a political message. Even the conquerors recognized the moral supremacy of the Kingdom of Wessex. Alfred's military, legal, naval, and religious reforms laid the foundation for a unified kingdom. For the first time since the fall of Rome, there was a strong central structure capable of defending its borders, administering justice, and projecting power. The concept of Englaland, the land of the Angles, began to take shape in the official documents of his reign. Alfred not only defended his kingdom, but envisioned a political unity that would overcome the tribal and dynastic divisions of the past. In the last years of his life, Alfredo kept up the pressure on the Danelaw, securing borders and encouraging the colonization of reconquered areas. He established mixed settlements where Christianized Angles and Danes lived side by side under the king's law. This peaceful integration allowed for the gradual expansion of Wessex's influence northwards. When Alfred died in 899, he left an unprecedented legacy. His reforms did not fade away with his death, but were continued by his sons and sons' grandsons. Thanks to his leadership, the Kingdom of Wessex became the nucleus of the future Kingdom of England. The title of Rex Angul Saxonum, i.e. King of the Anglo-Saxons, which was used by Alfred, anticipated the coronation of a king over the whole island. Without having conquered all of Britain, he had saved his political soul and planted the seed of a kingdom that, in the generations to come, would unify the island under a single crown. Danish rule and the reign of Canute the Great. At the beginning of the 11th century, England was once again the scene of a decisive struggle for power between the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and the Scandinavian forces. Alfred the Great's military reforms had held back the Viking advance for a generation, but the Danish heirs had not given up their ambitions. Under the leadership of kings such as Harald Bluetooth and Svend Forkbeard, Norse power was consolidated on the continent and began to direct its forces once again towards the rich lands of the south. The English king Ethelred II, known as the Indecisive, met this threat with indecision and tribute. From 991 onwards, he paid large sums of Danegeld, the tax to buy peace from the Vikings, weakening the economy and encouraging further invasions. The coasts were plundered, the cities burned, and fear set in among the population. In a desperate attempt to eliminate the internal threat, Ethelred ordered in the year 1002 the massacre of all Danes established in English territory. This action, known as the St. Britzio Day massacre, triggered a brutal retaliation. Svend Forkbeard, King of Denmark, seized the moment to launch the all-out invasion of England. For years he led systematic campaigns, conquering cities and demanding oaths of allegiance. In 1013, Svend was recognized as King of England. Anglo-Saxon rule seemed to be over. However, Svend died the following year. His son, the young Prince Canute, inherited an unfinished enterprise, not only to conquer England, but to subdue and rule it as part of a northern empire. In 1015, Canute landed again in England with a large army. Anglo-Saxon resistance, led by Ethelred's son, Edmund Ironside, was fierce. The two sides engaged in a series of battles throughout the year 1016. The final match took place in Assandun. The English troops were defeated, and Edmund agreed to divide the kingdom. Canute would rule the north and east. Edmund would keep Wessex. A few weeks later, Edmundo died. Canute proclaimed himself king of all England. What followed was not the traditional plunder of a Viking conqueror, but the deliberate building of a centralized Christian kingdom. Canute, though heir to a pagan tradition, adopted Christianity as the official religion of his government. He maintained Anglo-Saxon laws, respected ecclesiastical structures, and presented himself not as a foreign invader, but as a legitimate sovereign chosen by God to govern all Englishmen. He confirmed the properties of the church, guaranteed the security of the monasteries, and established diplomatic relations with the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor. Canute's government was based on a balance between Anglo-Saxon tradition and Scandinavian power. He organized the kingdom into provinces called earldoms, ruled by jarls or counts loyal to him. He issued laws protecting peasants, regulating trade and punishing banditry. A regular tax system was established to maintain the army and fleet. English currency was standardized and began to circulate throughout the territory. Peace returned to the island after decades of war, but Canute was not only King of England. In 1018, he inherited the crown of Denmark. In 1028, he conquered Norway, extending his dominion over the North Atlantic. The island of England became the administrative and economic center of a Scandinavian empire known as the North Sea Empire. From Winchester, Canute ruled vast territories linked by sea routes controlled by Viking fleets. The chronicles describe him traveling between his kingdoms accompanied by English and Danish advisors, establishing a new model of kingship that combined military force with Christian authority. His reign was also marked by symbolic acts. He visited Rome as a pilgrim, presenting himself not as a warrior but as a pious king. He declared himself protector of English monasteries and sponsored the construction of churches. This behavior surprised his contemporaries and was interpreted as a sign of God's judgment on England. A pagan conqueror had become a defender of the faith, ruling with justice and order. Despite his power, Canute failed to consolidate a lasting dynasty. Upon his death in 1035, the empire fragmented among his sons. Tensions between the Danes and the British resurfaced. The Anglo-Saxon nobility, led by the House of Wessex, maneuvered to restore a native line to the throne. Finally, in 1042, Edward the Confessor, a descendant of Alfred the Great, was crowned King of England. Danish rule was over, but its legacy lived on in administrative structures, maritime laws, and collective memory. Canute's reign marked a turning point. England was no longer a series of competing kingdoms. For the first time, the entire island had been ruled under a single crown with undisputed power. Although that power had come from the north, the experience of a unified kingdom served as a precedent for the definitive emergence of England as a political entity. Just a generation later, that same unity would be tested by a new invasion that would change the island's history forever. The Norman Conquest of 1066, William the Conqueror. By the middle of the 11th century, England was a stable Christian kingdom ruled by King Edward the Confessor. The son of a Norman princess, Edward had spent much of his life in Normandy during the Danish exile, adopting the customs and values of the duchy's court. His reign, which began in 1042, was marked by the presence of Norman nobles in key positions and by increasing tension with the powerful Anglo-Saxon family of the Godwinsons. Eduardo had no children. His succession, uncertain, became the turning point that would forever change the history of England. According to the Norman chronicles, Edward had promised the English throne in 1051 to his distant cousin William, Duke of Normandy. This oath had no legal equivalence in the English tradition, where the succession had to be confirmed by the Witenagemot, the Council of Anglo-Saxon nobles. However, William interpreted the alleged promise as a sacred right. To bolster his position, he demanded a formal oath from the leading English nobleman, Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex, and the most powerful man in the kingdom. In 1064, Harold was shipwrecked on the Norman coast and brought before William. Under circumstances that the Norman chronicles relate as coercive, Harold swore an oath on holy relics to support William's succession to the throne of England. For the Normans, this oath bound Harold under divine penalty. Edward the Confessor died on the 5th of January 1066. The next day, the Witenagemot proclaimed Harold Godwinson king. To the English, Harold was the natural defender of the kingdom. To William, he was a usurper and a perjurer. The Norman duke declared that the crown belonged to him by oath, royal promise, and divine right. He began the preparations for invasion. He gained the support of Pope Alexander II, who granted him a sacred standard, legitimizing the campaign as a crusade against a king who had broken a solemn oath. While William was assembling a fleet in Normandy, another claimant to the throne appeared in the north. Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, claimed rights over England based on ancient treaties with the Danish kings. Allied with Tostig, Harold Godwinson's exiled brother, he landed in Northumbria in September. Harold marched quickly north and engaged the invaders at the Battle of Stamford Bridge on the 25th of September, 1066. It was a crushing victory for the English. Hardrada and Tostig were killed in the fighting. The Norwegian threat had been eliminated, but victory came at a fatal cost. That same day, William landed on the south shore at Pevensey. Harold immediately marched south, forcing his exhausted army to travel more than 300 kilometers in a few days. On 14th October, Harold's and William's armies clashed near Hastings. The battle was a confrontation between two military worlds. The Anglo-Saxons fought on foot, forming a compact shield wall on the hill of Senlac. The Normans fielded a combined force of infantry, archers, and heavy cavalry. The first Norman attacks were repulsed. The cavalry failed to break through the English line. Then, according to the chronicles, William employed an innovative tactic, feigned retreat. Simulating a disorderly retreat, he lured the English down the hill. When they broke the formation, the Normans turned on them and massacred them. The battle continued for hours. Harold, fighting in the center of the English line, finally fell. Tradition relates that an arrow pierced his eye, leaving the English army without its leader. By nightfall, the hill was littered with corpses. The English army was dispersed. William had won. After the battle, William marched to London. Southern cities quickly submitted. In December, the Duke was crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey, becoming William I, known to history as William the Conqueror. With his coronation, England entered a new era dominated by the Norman nobility, the feudal system, and the complete reorganization of political and territorial power. The construction of feudal power. After William's coronation in 1066, England became the epicenter of an unprecedented social transformation. It was not simply the change of a monarch, but the complete reconfiguration of the structure of the kingdom. William did not limit himself to replacing the Anglo-Saxon leaders. He dismantled the very basis of the previous system and built in its place a feudal order that placed the king as the supreme owner of all the land. Each castle, each village, each field came to depend directly on the monarch, who rewarded his faithful vassals with land in exchange for absolute obedience. The first step was the total replacement of the nobility. The great Anglo-Saxon lords were dispossessed of their lands, which were given to Norman knights who had accompanied William in the conquest. In less than a decade, more than 90% of the kingdom's noble properties were in foreign hands. This redistribution not only rewarded the king's allies, but ensured that all large landowners were directly linked to the crown by ties of vassalage. The Norman feudal system was based on a pyramidal hierarchy. At the top was the king, lord of all the domains. Below, barons were given sprawling fiefs and swore allegiance to the monarch by a solemn act that involved kneeling before him and placing their hands between his. In exchange for land, they were obligated to provide troops, cavalry, and resources in times of war. These barons, in turn, gave portions of land to lesser knights, establishing an interconnected web of personal obligations. Land was no longer an ancestral right, but a privilege granted by the king and revocable if one failed in the duty of fidelity. To consolidate his rule, William authorized the massive construction of castles. Wooden and stone fortresses were erected throughout the kingdom, many of them on ancient cities Saxon. These castles were not symbols of prestige, but instruments of military and administrative control. From its walls, roads, rivers, and villages were watched. The people had to swear allegiance to the lord of the castle, who exercised judicial, fiscal, and military authority in the name of the king. Castles such as the Tower of London became nerve centers of Norman power. The next strategic step was the exhaustive registration of the kingdom. In 1085, William ordered the Domesday Book, a detailed census of all the estates, inhabitants, livestock, fields, mills, and forests of England. Never before had such a meticulous exercise of territorial control been attempted. Each owner had to declare the origin of their land, how much they produced, and how much tribute they owed. This book, completed in 1086, allowed the king to impose taxes accurately and avoid disputes among his vassals. Its name alluded to the Last Judgment. As on the Day of Judgment, nothing could be hidden, and no one could appeal against what was recorded. The feudal system implied not only territorial control, but also the establishment of a new legal order. The seigneurial courts became the centers of local justice. The castle was the place where disputes were settled, sentences were carried out, and order was maintained. The king reserved the right to intervene in major causes, consolidating a double justice, royal and feudal. Villages paid rents and tribute, worked on the lord's lands, and were obliged to serve in the local militia if called upon. The rural economy was reorganized around the manor, a self-sufficient unit under the control of the feudal lord. Free peasants could own plots, but they had to comply with labor obligations and taxes. The serfs, on the other hand, were bound to the land and could not leave it without permission. The English countryside was filled with villages under the surveillance of a castle, symbolizing the new reality. Power was armed, fortified, and hierarchical. William also secured his dominion through the church. He appointed loyal Norman bishops and reformed the monasteries according to the rule of Cluny. The church became an ally of the feudal system, legitimizing the king's power and providing a parallel administrative network. The bishops, in addition to spiritually guiding the people, administered lands, collected rents, and convened synods in the name of the monarch. Norman feudalism was not simply a foreign imposition, but a sophisticated machinery for maintaining control. Each castle represented a piece on the royal board. Each vassal was a link in the chain of dependency that led to the throne. England was fully integrated into a strict feudal structure where the king was overlord of men and lands, and where loyalty was measured in knights, fortresses, and tributes. In less than 20 years, the old Anglo-Saxon kingdom had completely disappeared under the armor of Norman power. The reign of Henry II and the figure of Thomas Becket. Henry II ascended the throne of England in 1154 with the firm intention of restoring royal authority after the chaos and anarchy of the previous reign. From the beginning of his government, he set out to limit the power of the barons, strengthen the judicial system, and establish rigorous control over their territories. For Henry, the law was the fundamental instrument of royal power, and it had to be applied above all external influence, including that of the church. His reign marked the birth of the English legal system, with royal courts, itinerant judges, and written records. Justice, which had previously depended on the local lord, now passed into the hands of the king. To consolidate his authority over the church, Henry decided to appoint an ally as Archbishop of Canterbury, the highest spiritual authority in the kingdom. He chose Thomas Becket, his chancellor and personal friend, a shrewd and loyal man who had administered the affairs of state effectively. Henrique believed that by holding the most important ecclesiastical office, Becket would serve as a bridge between the crown and the church, ensuring that the latter remained subordinate to royal interests. However, after his appointment in 1162, Thomas Becket took an unexpected stance. He renounced the luxury of court, embraced the ascetic life, and declared that his supreme duty was to God, not to the king. His transformation surprised Enrique. The king was waiting for a political ally. He obtained a spiritual rival. The clash erupted when Henry attempted to try clerics accused of crimes before royal rather than ecclesiastical courts. Becket argued that clerics could only be judged by the church, arguing that the crown had no authority over men of God. Henry responded with the Constitutions of Clarendon in 1164, a set of rules that limited ecclesiastical jurisdiction and reinforced royal rights. Becket refused to accept them. Accused of treason, he fled to France and remained in exile for 6 years, denouncing the king's interference with the Pope. Meanwhile, Henry confiscated his property and pressured the English clergy to swear allegiance to the crown. The conflict reached its head in 1170. Henry, in an attempt at political reconciliation, allowed Becket to return to England. But as soon as he returned, Becket excommunicated several bishops favourable to the king. Enrique, frustrated by the continuous resistance, would have uttered a phrase that would go down in history. "Is there no one to free me from this turbulent priest?" 4 Norman knights interpreted his words as an order. On December 29, 1170, the knights entered Canterbury Cathedral. Becket, dressed in his liturgical robes, refused to flee or to place himself under protection. He was surrounded at the high altar. Before the horrified clergy, the knights attacked, beheading the archbishop inside the sanctuary. The murder shocked Christendom. Thomas Becket was immediately revered as a martyr. His tomb became a place of pilgrimage, and his figure a symbol of the resistance of spiritual power in the face of earthly authority. Henry II was forced to humiliate himself publicly. In 1174, he appeared barefoot in Canterbury and allowed himself to be whipped by the monks as penance. Despite this moral defeat, his reign consolidated a strong judicial system with written records, jury trials, and unified laws that laid the foundation of English law. The conflict with Becket did not weaken the crown, revealed, however, that the church would remain a powerful political actor for centuries to come, capable of challenging even England's strongest king. England's archers, the birth of Europe's most feared weapon. The military power of medieval England was not forged only in the stone halls of its castles, but in the open fields where peasants and villagers, from childhood, drew the longbow until they mastered it as an extension of their own body. Unlike the European heavy cavalry, a symbol of feudal prestige, the English longbow emerged as a weapon of the people, the product of mandatory laws and constant discipline. From the 13th century, kings began to dictate rules that required all free men to practice archery on Sundays and holidays. It was not a hobby, but a national duty. While other powers were resorting to mercenaries, England was creating an army of professional archers trained from childhood. The longbow, usually made of yew, measured about 2 meters and required extraordinary force to draw it. Its rope projected long arrows with steel tips capable of piercing armor from more than 200 meters. An experienced archer could fire up to 10 arrows per minute, saturating the battlefield with deadly rain. The anatomy of the archers was modified by continuous use. Skeletons have been found with hyperdeveloped bones of the left arm, a sign of a life dedicated to mastery of this weapon. The longbow was not only an instrument of hunting or war, but a properly English martial culture. Its first major tactical demonstration occurred in 1298, during the reign of Edward I, known as the Hammer of the Scots. At the Battle of Falkirk, the Scots, led by William Wallace, relied on schiltrons, defensive formations of pikes designed to stop cavalry. Edward, instead of attacking directly with his knights, placed the Welsh and English archers on the flanks. When the fighting began, arrows fell en masse on the Scots, destabilizing their formations and opening gaps. For the first time, the longbow proved that it could destroy not only light troops, but compact, heavy infantry units. From Falkirk, the longbow became the backbone of the English army. The kings understood that mastery of this weapon gave England a unique advantage over its continental enemies. During the 14th century, new laws were established prohibiting men from playing sports other than archery, to ensure that each peasant could be mobilized as an archer when the kingdom needed him. The monks recorded the number of wooden rods imported to make bows and arrows. Preparing for war, it was a civil obligation, almost a national sacrament. The longbow not only transformed the structure of the army, but also the English mentality. It allowed men of humble origins without horses or titles to become the deciding factor on the battlefield. The French knights, trained in the art of hand-to-hand combat, looked down on archers, but this contempt would prove fatal. The following decades would see the longbow move from a defensive instrument to a weapon of conquest. With it, the English would defeat numerically superior armies, ushering in a new era in medieval warfare. Where once the steel of knights dominated, now the speed, discipline, and deadly precision of the rope stretched by the English peasant ruled. The Magna Carta of 1215, the birth of English freedom. At the beginning of the 13th century, the government of England was marked by growing tension between the crown and the nobility. King John, known as John the Landless, had inherited a troubled and impoverished kingdom, and his attempts to regain lost territories in France led him to impose ever higher taxes on barons and clergy. Real justice became an instrument of punishment and extortion. Arbitrary confiscations of land multiplied, and the castles of the nobility were occupied by forces loyal to the king. The royal power, absolute and unbridled, began to provoke widespread discontent among those who had traditionally been pillars of the kingdom. The conflict reached its peak in 1215. The most powerful barons in the country, led by Robert Fitzwalter, openly rebelled and formed an armed alliance known as the Armies of God. Its aim was no longer simply to contain abuses, but to impose concrete limits on monarchical authority. They did not seek to dethrone the king, but to subject him to the law. Meeting in the Runnymede Valley on the banks of the River Thames, they demanded that John sign a document codifying in writing the traditional rights of the nobles and establishing permanent restrictions on royal power. On June 15, 1215, surrounded by the armies of the barons, John was forced to affix his seal to the Magna Carta. It was not a voluntary or ceremonial act, but an agreement imposed by force. The charter was composed of 63 clauses, many of them derived from the Anglo-Saxon and Norman customs that had governed feudal life for centuries, but which until that moment had never been officially guaranteed against the king's will. Among the most important provisions was the principle that no free man could be arrested, imprisoned, or dispossessed of his property without a legal trial by his peers. For the first time, the king was declared to be subject to the law. The ability to impose taxes without the consent of the Council of Nobles was limited, arbitrary confiscations were prohibited, and inheritance and property rights were protected. Justice was regulated by norms written, not by monarchical whim. One of the most momentous clauses stated that there was a council of 25 barons with authority to ensure compliance with the charter, and if the king violated it, they had the legal right to take up arms against him. This principle introduced in a formal way the idea that obedience to the king was not absolute but conditional on his respect for the law. The monarchy ceased to be an incontestable force and became an institution regulated by rules agreed with its most powerful subjects. The 100 Years' War and Joan of Arc. The conflict known as the 100 Years' War was not a single continuous war, but a succession of campaigns, truces, broken alliances, and renewed aspirations for conquest that lasted from 1337 to 1453. For more than a century, England and France disputed not only territories, but also the right to the French crown, control of international trade, and military supremacy in Western Europe. This war completely transformed medieval politics, introduced new tactics, redefined the importance of the common soldier, and would mark the ultimate decline of the feudal system based on heavy cavalry. England, initially victorious, saw the rise of an unexpected figure who would change the course of the conflict, Joan of Arc. The origin of the conflict was found in a succession vacuum. In 1328, King Charles IV of France died without leaving a male heir. Salic law prevented a woman from inheriting the crown, but it also prevented the transmission of rights through the female line. Edward III of England, grandson of Philip IV of France by his mother Elizabeth, claimed the French throne, arguing that his ancestry gave him the legitimate right. The French nobility rejected his claim and elected Philip VI from the Valois branch. The dynastic dispute was the political trigger, but behind it were hidden economic interests. France controlled Flanders, a textile centre and the main buyer of English wool. Controlling the French throne meant controlling European trade. In 1337, Edward III declared war on France and initiated the first phase of the conflict. The initial campaigns were characterized by the massive use of the English longbow, which had already proven its effectiveness at Falkirk and other internal battles. The first major victory came in 1346 at the Battle of Crécy. The French army, composed of heavily armed knights, repeatedly charged the English lines, where thousands of archers fired a steady hail of arrows piercing armor and knocking down horses. The cavalry, a symbol of feudal prestige, was annihilated by peasants armed with bows. This engagement marked the beginning of the decline of chivalry as the center of medieval warfare. After Crécy, the English besieged Calais, which fell in 1347. This strategic city would allow England to maintain a permanent entry point to the continent. Meanwhile, the Black Prince, son of Edward III, won another crucial victory at Poitiers in 1356. There, the French King John II was captured and the French nobility was beheaded. The Treaty of Bretigny, signed in 1360, granted vast territories to England, including Aquitaine, making Edward III the most powerful lord in Western Europe. However, the war did not end. France reorganized its army and began to recover territories during the second phase of the conflict. King Charles V avoided direct confrontations and opted for a war of attrition, recovering fortresses through negotiations and occasional attacks. England was facing economic and political problems aggravated by the Black Death. The situation changed again with the accession of Henry V to the English throne in 1413, who resumed the war with renewed determination. In 1415, Henry V launched a new invasion of France. Despite having a small army, he won one of the most memorable victories in military history at the Battle of Agincourt. The muddy terrain, the narrowness of the pitch, and the English discipline with the longbow were decisive. The waves of French cavalry were trapped in the mud, relentlessly attacked by English archers. Thousands of French nobles were killed or captured. The victory made Henry V a legendary figure and reinforced the idea that England was destined to rule France. Agincourt's success was followed by the conquest of Normandy. In 1420, the Treaty of Troyes declared Henry V the rightful heir to the French crown upon the death of Charles VI. The latter's son, the Dauphin Charles, was declared illegitimate. Henry V married Catherine of Valois, daughter of the French king. It seemed that Edward III's dream was about to be fulfilled. An English king would sit on the throne of France. But fate suddenly changed. Enrique V died in 1422, leaving as heir a child of just 9 months, Henry VI. Charles VI died shortly after, and the kingdom was divided between two powers. The English government controlled Paris and Normandy, while the Dauphin Charles, without resources or prestige, resisted in the south. It was at this time of deep crisis for France that an unexpected figure emerged, a young peasant woman from the Domremy region named Joan of Arc. He said he heard divine voices ordering him to save France and crown the Dauphin as the legitimate king. In 1429, Joan convinced the Dauphin and was sent to liberate the besieged city of Orléans. His presence transformed the spirit of the French soldiers. With determination and tactics, the French managed to break the siege. The victory turned the tide of the war. Joan led the Dauphin to Reims, where he was crowned Charles VII in a symbolic ceremony that restored French monarchical legitimacy. The English tried to capture it in order to destroy the symbol it represented. In 1430, it was captured by the Burgundians and handed over to the English. Joan was tried for heresy and condemned to die at the stake. His execution in 1431 did not stop the French Renaissance. On the contrary, it made her a martyr and strengthened national morale. France began to recover territories through a reorganized army financed by a new centralized taxation. The reconquest culminated in 1453 with the Battle of Hastings, where French artillery destroyed the last English army on the continent. England retained only Calais. The conflict that had begun as a dynastic dispute ended with the consolidation of the French state under a centralized monarchy and the birth of a national identity. For England, the war marked the end of its continental aspirations and the beginning of a retreat that would transform its gaze towards the sea. For more than 100 years, the longbow, chivalry, alliances, and the fate of kings and peasants were intertwined in the longest conflict of the Middle Ages. And a young peasant girl, guided by her faith, was the instrument that changed the course of European history. the Wars of the Roses and the end of the Middle Ages. By the middle of the 15th century, England emerged weakened after more than 100 years of war in France. The final defeat in 1453 had cost lives, fortunes, and prestige. King Henry VI, who belonged to the House of Lancaster, was a weak monarch prone to bouts of madness and manipulated by warring factions within the court. The authority of the monarchy, already eroded by military failure and tax burdens, collapsed before the ambition of the nobility. In this scenario of political chaos, two royal houses emerged that claimed dynastic legitimacy: the Lancastrians, represented by Henry VI himself, and the Yorks, headed by Richard Plantagenet, Duke of York. From their rivalry would be born a bloody conflict that would divide England for 3 decades, the Wars of the Roses. The name of the conflict comes from the emblems of both houses, the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York. But beyond the symbols, the war represented the struggle for the throne between two lineages descended from Edward III. In 1453, the crisis was exacerbated when King Henry VI suffered a mental breakdown that left him incapacitated. During this period, Richard of York was appointed protector of the kingdom. Queen Margaret of Anjou, the king's wife and a member of the French nobility, became his fiercest rival, determined to keep the throne for her son, Prince Edward. The first major battle was fought at St. Albans in 1455. York's forces defeated Lancaster's supporters, marking the beginning of open warfare. Although Henry VI was captured, he was not deposed. Over the next few years, the conflict intensified through a series of brief campaigns where alliances were constantly changing and armies were quickly formed with the support of local nobles. Unlike previous wars, this was not a fight against a foreign enemy, but a civil war where entire families were divided by loyalty to one house or another. In 1460, Richard of York formally claimed the crown. Parliament recognized the legitimacy of his lineage but agreed that Henry VI would hold the throne until his death, after which Richard would inherit it. Queen Margaret did not accept this agreement. He gathered an army and engaged Richard at the Battle of Wakefield. Richard was killed in combat, and his head was displayed on the walls of York with a paper crown as a sign of mockery. However, his cause did not end there. His son, Edward, Earl of March, took the Yorkist leadership and demonstrated formidable military ability. In 1461, Edward definitively defeated the Lancastrians in the Battle of Towton, the bloodiest of the war, with thousands killed in a single day. After the victory, he was crowned King Edward IV. At just 19 years of age, Edward consolidated Yorkist power and seemed to put an end to the war. Henry VI was captured and imprisoned in the Tower of London. However, peace was short-lived. The noble alliances soon fragmented. The Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker for his decisive role in Edward's coronation, turned against him when the king made decisions without his consent. Warwick switched sides, freed Henry VI, and briefly restored Lancastrian rule. But Edward IV returned to power after defeating Warwick at the Battle of Barnet in 1471. In that same year, Queen Margaret gathered an army in her son's name. The decisive battle took place at Tewkesbury. Yorkist forces defeated the Lancastrians, and Prince Edward was killed in action. With him disappeared the direct line of Lancastrian succession. Henry VI was assassinated in the Tower shortly afterwards. Edward IV became the undisputed monarch. Over the next few years, England experienced relative stability under the reign of Edward IV. However, upon his death in 1483, the conflict resurfaced. His son, Edward V, barely 12 years old, was declared king. His uncle, the Duke of Gloucester, was appointed protector. Soon after, he accused his nephews of illegitimacy, declared them unfit for the throne, and assumed the crown himself as Richard III. The young heirs were locked up in the Tower of London and mysteriously disappeared. Although there are no official records, it is believed that they were killed on Richard's orders, becoming the princes of the Tower, a symbol of the end of dynastic innocence. Richard III's reign was marked by distrust and resentment from former Yorkist allies. Meanwhile, the surviving Lancastrian faction reorganized around a nobleman exiled in France, Henry Tudor, an illegitimate descendant of the House of Lancaster. With the support of disgruntled nobles and foreign funding, Henry invaded England in 1485. Richard came out to meet him at the Battle of Bosworth Field. The confrontation was brief but decisive. Richard personally fought in combat, attempting to kill Henry and end the war in one blow. He was surrounded and killed on the battlefield. His body, covered in wounds, was found in the mud. He had been the last English king to die in combat. Henry Tudor's victory ended the Wars of the Roses. He was crowned Henry VII, founder of the Tudor dynasty. To seal the reconciliation, he married Elizabeth of York, symbolically uniting the two roses into one, the Tudor rose, white and red, intertwined. With the accession to the throne of Henry VII, feudal England, marked by civil wars, gave way to a new centralized order, where royal authority was strengthened and the transition to the modern state began. The end of the Wars of the Roses not only marked the end of a dynastic conflict, but the definitive closure of the Middle Ages in England, opening the path to the consolidation of a strong national monarchy and the emergence of a new era.